Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Schwartz, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, and I am delighted to welcome everyone to our event today. For over 70 years, the Council has brought our community world perspectives through civil discourse and always with a staunchly nonpartisan lens. Much has changed in the past 70 years, and much more has changed in the past year. It is hard to believe that so much of the world and our operations and connectivity has gone virtual, these council programs included. But as we've moved online, you came with us, and we thank you for that. This shift also does allow us to host guests from around the world more easily, just like we have today's speaker joining us from the UK. In addition to our speaker and travel programs, we work with over 2,500 youth across 85 schools annually, as the leading provider of foreign affairs and international education across this region. I'd like to offer a special welcome to the students and teachers who participate in the Council's education programs throughout this year. Maybe some of you are cutting class for this, but I think it's okay. You're sure to learn something from today's guest that you can use in school and in your real life. Now, if you have any technical issues during the program or you'd like to send questions for our speaker to answer, please use the questions function and we will get to as many of them as possible in the time allotted. You can type in questions at any time throughout the webinar and we'll keep track. And now I'd like to briefly introduce today's guest. We are delighted to welcome Adrian Wooldridge, who is the Economist's political editor and writes the Budget column, which provides an analysis of British life and politics in the tradition of Walter Bagehot, editor of The Economist from 1861 to 1877. He previously wrote the Schumpeter column on business, finance, and management as well. On a personal note, I admit that I am a huge fan. I started reading The Economist as an atypical teenager in high school, and I had always asked my parents for a subscription to The Economist for my birthday gifts when I was in high school and college. It was not the most typical thing to ask for from your parents, but I can say that reading The Economist for so many years has been a professional and personal pleasure and helps me understand the world and the many politics and complex situations we live in. So Adrian, I'm personally very excited to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Adrian is also the co-author of today's featured book. It's called The Wake-Up Call: Why the Pandemic Has Exposed Weaknesses of the West and How to Fix It. And it's refreshing to have that last piece on how to fix it. Instead of just looking at the problems, we talk about solutions too. If you'd like to purchase a copy of this book, you can do so on the Council's website through the link to Joseph Fox Bookshop, an independent bookstore here in Philadelphia. We'll start with some brief opening remarks from Adrian, followed by a moderated discussion, and then of course, we'll get to your questions and answers soon. Adrian, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very kind invitation. And I think it's about a year now since you in Philadelphia went into lockdown. It's a year since we in Britain went into lockdown. We're still in lockdown now, although we've out and gone back in. But I think this experience with COVID has been an extraordinary experience because it was as though the entire world was set an examination at the same time. And the results of the performance of that examination have been extremely interesting, extremely revealing, and in many ways extremely surprising, because they tell us a lot of things that we would perhaps prefer not to know about the general efficiency of government, state apparatus, and politics around the world. I think the first year of COVID was very much a sort of a year of Anglo-Saxon failure. It was a year in which both America and Great Britain really failed in really serious ways to get to grips with this pandemic. It was a year of failure of political leadership. Both Boris Johnson and President Trump did extremely badly in responding, first of all, to the initial arrival of the pandemic, and continued, I think, to fluff around, well, in Boris Johnson's case for several months, in Trump's case, I think, right the way until he lost the election. It was a year of failure of the health services, particularly in the United States. The American health service was revealed to be patchy, in many ways inefficient, a health service that was really not designed to promote public health, but is a patchwork of solutions to problems driven by the old, the rich, and elective medicine. It wasn't what you would design for a pandemic. And it was a year of failure of society at large to come to terms with a pandemic, a year in which people were very reluctant to wear face masks, very reluctant to go into lockdown, very reluctant to do the basic things that you would need to do to stop a pandemic from spreading. And as a result of that, the result of the pandemic was at its worst in Britain and in the United States. I think in the United States now you have a figure of about 1,600 people per million dying from the pandemic. Here it's about 1,900 per million, far higher than in Europe. And so a year of humiliation for the Anglo-Saxon model, and a year in which a lot of people, particularly on mainland Europe, pointed at Britain and pointed at the United States and said that model doesn't work. They just weren't up to the biggest public health catastrophe we've had since the Spanish influenza. Now, I think we're in a very different era. We're in an era of continental European humiliation. And it's a period in which Britain and the United States are doing very well in terms of distributing the vaccine. Britain, I think, is more than 30, probably about 40 people per 100 who've been vaccinated. America, a bit lower, about 34, I think, people who've been vaccinated, but a very successful rollout, certainly in this country. And I believe that's also the case in the United States. And it's definitely the case that Britain and the United States are doing much, much better than continental Europe. Continental Europe has made an absolute mess of this whole thing. They didn't get hold of enough vaccines early on. They didn't establish contracts early on. They didn't work out the wording of the contracts. They've now behaved really childishly and foolishly over the AstraZeneca vaccine, with President Macron saying on the basis of no evidence at all that it didn't work for people over 60, with some countries now withdrawing the vaccine, not distributing the vaccine on the basis of evidence of blood clotting, which doesn't seem, according to many experts, at least that I've spoken to, be any higher than blood clotting would be in a normal population of people who didn't have this vaccine. And so if we think of the idiocies of President Trump talking about injecting yourself with detergent or whatever it was that he suggested that you inject yourself with, there was a lot of laughter in Europe and saying that Trump was saying foolish things, that he was driven by short-term political consideration or even just rage at the way that the pandemic was undermining his election chances. We got exactly the same thing with Macron saying that this didn't work for people over 60. So we've had a period of humiliation for the United States, a period of testing in which the United States failed, plus Britain. We've had a period of humiliation and testing now only beginning for Europe, but getting worse and worse. They don't seem to be getting the vaccine rollout any better. They're just now going back into lockdown with the third wave coming. But the one part of the world that hasn't had humiliation, that hasn't been defeated by this vaccine, is the Far East. It started in China, but China very rapidly got under control and is now basically back to normal life. The Chinese claim that they've got about 3 deaths per million. That is probably wrong. It's probably 10 times that. But even if it's 10 times that, that's 30 people per million compared with America's almost 1,000 people per million. So it's a much, much lower rate. Taiwan, I think, has had about 8 deaths and 100 cases of COVID since the pandemic started. South Korea, about 100, Japan, about 100. So very, very, very much lower levels of the pandemic there. And a lot of people say, well, it's because they've had SARS to recover from, so they've had experience of this. There's truth in that, but I don't think it's the whole truth, because I think what you see is a correlation between their ability, the state's ability to respond to the COVID pandemic, and the state's ability to deliver education, to deliver healthcare more broadly, and to deliver a lot of public services. And I think what we're seeing here is a test of the quality of the public sector of government, which the West collectively has failed, and the Far East collectively has really done quite well in it, has done really come through with flying colors. So I think that this is a very, very important turning point in history. If you go back to the year 1500, let's say, China was the most powerful country in the world because it had the best government in the world. It had this huge Mandarin civil service elite, which governed this vast territory on the basis of the selection of Mandarin civil servants from across the whole country. It was an extremely well-governed country. Europe at that time was a country in which you had feuding groups of people, you had religious wars. It was really a blood-stained battlefield. And since then, Europe and then the United States has pulled ahead of China over and over and over again, because it's pulled ahead in terms of the quality of its government. It invented and designed nation states. It invented and designed the liberal limited government state. It invented and designed the welfare state. And all that time, the Chinese government system atrophied. It became frozen in aspic almost. And so if you go back to the 1960s, you have a time when the Chinese government is basically a complete disaster under Mao Zedong. The country is falling apart. There's a cultural revolution which is tearing China apart. There's a government that just doesn't basically work. At the same time, the West, particularly the United States, is sending men to the moon, is trying to abolish poverty, is doing all sorts of really ambitious things. And ever since the 1960s, things have begun to change. The Chinese, the Far East, starting in Singapore, but spreading to China, has begun to rediscover the art of government. And it may well be the case that what COVID is revealing is that the decadence of Western governments is really quite advanced, and that the advance of Eastern governments, particularly Chinese governments, is really also quite advanced. And we may look back on this year, these couple of years, not as the year in which Trump lost an election, not as the year in which we had a pandemic, but in the year at which China once again took precedence over the West, leapt ahead of the West, and we went back to the status quo ante, the status quo as it was 1500, in which China was the center of the world and in which the West was once more a peripheral power. Now, I don't believe that's true, but I do believe it's a real possibility. I do believe that we need to have a wake-up call. We need to treat this pandemic as a learning opportunity, as a way of understanding quite how far we've let our governments go backwards, become decadent, become decayed, and a year in which we've learned that the Chinese, as well as other East Asian countries, have really pulled ahead in certain crucial ways. So if there's any advantage in having a pandemic, there's not a great advantage in having a pandemic, but I think it may well have highlighted that the world, the balance of power in terms of state capacity has really shifted quite dramatically. That's what we're trying to say in the wake-up call. And I think it's been really underlined even more by the dismal performance of the Europeans with vaccines. That's all I want to say to start off with, and I really look forward to your questions.
That's a good bit to start off with. A lot of ideas, right? And the pandemic is in of itself a crisis, but it's revealing, like all crises do, other cracks and fractures. And in our country here in the United States, of course, we have a new administration in place. So I'd love to just start by asking you, as we near Biden's administration's first 100 days in office, are you seeing true promise in how his administration is handling the pandemic that gives you hope or optimism against how you might have been feeling, 6 months ago?
I'm more optimistic than I was 6 months ago, because partly because of the vaccine, which is a miracle of the private sector, and also public sector distribution and cooperation between the private and the public sectors. I think that Biden has got off to a very good start, in the sense that the promise of getting 100 million vaccines distributed and 100 million sort of checks in people's bank account is right. I think that, the faster the vaccine is distributed, the more that we will be able to get back to normal life. And the faster money is distributed to people, the more likely we are to pull out of what is a difficult economic time. So in that sense, I'm impressed with Biden. In other ways, I'm less impressed. I think he's been, I think that the policy towards the southern border is extremely dangerous. I think it's ill-considered. I think that if a country can't control its border, and if a country creates incentives for poorer people to flow across the border, then that creates a great deal of anxiety within the domestic population. It creates a great deal of misery on the border, and it's going to be it's going to get worse for Biden and his administration. But I think a good start with some problems. But I would go further than this and say that America's problem with with dealing with COVID was not just about Trump. I mean, Trump was as much a sign of anything, a sign of a problem, a representative of a problem, as he was a cause of a problem. If you look at America's healthcare system, which, as I say, is very patchy, very, very expensive, and essentially driven by people with money who want problems fixed rather than by public health logic, then that's not something that Trump invented. It's obviously not something that he tried to address, but it's not something that he invented. It's something that's been there organically for a long time, but something that, in terms of cost control, really started to get out of control in the 1960s. And he's doing nothing to address costs and doing nothing to address the big structural problems. He hasn't had much time yet, but I think that's more than just an individual problem. I think America's extraordinary problem with race, again, is not something which Trump invented. It's something very, very deep rooted in the country. Obviously, it goes back to slavery, but it's not something that will be easily solved and will not be solved by one administration. And also, I think that America's problems with its political system, the way that the political system works, both in terms of paralysis and polarization, which makes it very, very difficult for problems to be addressed or solved, again, is not something which Trump invented. He was a product of that problem. But I have a book on my shelves sitting around here, published, I think, in 2007, called The Second Civil War by Ron Brownstein, saying that America was essentially in a state of civil war over its politics because nobody could agree on anything. And these are problems which are very deep structural problems. If you have a political system which is essentially designed to stop people from doing things unless you can get broad cooperation between people of different political factions, different parties, and you combine that with a highly polarized party-based political system where the parties are very ideologically divided, then that's a very, very difficult thing to bring together. It's a system that it used to work when you had strange political parties which were coalitions of Southern Democrats and Northern liberals in the Democratic Party, and Southern and Northern and conservatives and also liberals within the Republican Party as well. You could feel your way across party boundaries and put together coalitions, as JFK brilliantly did in the 1960s to create problem-solving policies. But now you can't do that. It's impossible to reach across party lines because of the role that ideology plays, and because the parties have sorted themselves into rival ideological blocks. And it's very difficult to see how you can get big solutions to problems going on. So I think that Biden has done fine. He's done fine so far, but I don't see him pushing through big solutions to these ideological, to the big political problems that America faces in his first term, at least.
And in your book, you do talk about solutions and governments and make recommendations to governments to take significant actions, like raising the retirement age, providing free healthcare for all, paying civil servants better, among many others. And it's refreshing to have solutions and recommendations rather than a criticism and complaint. And to build on this, of the things that you recommend in your book, do you see any, after what you just characterized the American political system as viable as possible in the next few years?
Well, we tried to lay out some, not only did we try and lay out some solutions, we sort of invented a great political reformer who we called who we call William Lincoln, who is really a compound of William Gladstone, the great reforming prime minister in Britain in the middle of the 19th century, and Abraham Lincoln, the great president. And I apologize for the sexism there of taking two men and putting them together. We might, have taken the prime minister of New Zealand and the chancellor of Germany and have two women coming together. But what we wanted to argue in that is that you need somebody who's very, very energetic, who's very, very committed to a non-ideological approach to politics. And we said to this, we constructed this guy and said, all you need to do is, you need to do this great thing, which is to fix American politics. But we give you one constraint, that you can only use ideas that have worked around the world. So we're not trying to present pie in the sky solutions. We're trying to present ideas that have worked all around the world, and saying, put these ideas together and see if you can construct a coherent policy. So we tried to construct what we thought would be a viable healthcare system based mostly on the Canadian model. We tried to construct a viable sort of notion of how you could reform central government, taking ideas from Singapore. I do think it's the case in the past that America has managed, just as one gives up on America, it does manage to reform itself. It goes through a period of really energetic government. It did that in the 1930s. Under FDR, it did it in the early 20th century. Under TR, it did it in the 1960s, first of all under Kennedy, and then more so under Johnson. So it is capable of doing that, but I'm not sure a 77-year-old person who comes after this turmoil of the Trump administration is the right person to do it. And I think, again, whenever it's happened in the past, it's happened when parties have been able to operate across party lines when they've been much more ideologically fluid than they now are. I'm really worried about the ideological fixity of and polarization of American politics in a system, a Madisonian system, which relies on factions coming together. I would say that the idea of fixing the American healthcare system or changing the American healthcare system fundamentally is obviously a very ambitious one. But the idea of raising the retirement age, that's surely not insane. I mean, the retirement age was fixed in the 1930s when people could expect to live when, they wouldn't live much longer after they'd retired. It's been unchanged, mostly unchanged, I think, since then. It's certainly by global standards, very low. I think it's 65, 66 in the United States, it's 70 in Britain, it's 70 in Sweden. I think it's, you do need to fix it, but in order to fix it, you need two things. America has a social security system which is, leading the country to bankruptcy, which cannot at the moment be afforded, and which can only be afforded by sucking money out of other pockets of money, the sort of money that should be used to fix airports, that should be used to fix bridges that are falling down, is being sucked into to fund the social security system. And you could actually fix it by raising taxes just a little bit, and by raising retirement age just a little bit, which had a massive effect because you've got such a big economy, and it would fill that financial hole. The trouble is the Republicans won't raise taxes and the Democrats won't raise the retirement age. The nearest you came really to addressing these problems was under Obama, and with the stuff that went through, mostly through Congress, there was a whole committee which wanted to do this, and unfortunately Obama, I think, failed to put enough support behind it. So he has demonstrated, I think, by very, very big, by the very rapid rollout and very big stimulus package, that he is capable of doing something. But I'm not sure that degree of dynamism will hold up.
And with all of these challenges you've laid out with the American political system and the factions and our structure of government and still managing the pandemic, a new administration, getting things done, of course, will be hard. And there's some things that we might be able to tackle, some things that will be harder. I'm headed towards a question around American, and I would borrow your country too, the UK's reputation in the world, right? With the failures that both countries displayed during the pandemic, which shocked many people by laying bare a lot of structural deficiencies, and the success in the West, other folks are looking around and saying, who's in charge here, right?
Sure.
And can we trust the UK? Can we trust the United States? Do they trust each other when we are deciding as emerging economies, fast-growing economies, where to build alliances and where to place our allegiance? So many say, of course, that countries like ours need to rebuild trust and demonstrate and prove success and that we can change. So having said that, and then taking your comments just a moment before, that the outlook's not great for us to change. Where does that leave us? Does that let Asian countries continue to sort of run away with the lead and continue to prove success while we flounder? Are there ways to shift this dynamic?
Well, there were two things that went really badly for the United States, I think, in the last few years. One was the approach to dealing with the pandemic, which revealed big problems with domestic state capacity, essentially, and that, I think, has been a worry to the rest of the world. The fact that you could have a president who is so eccentric in his approach to such a serious problem as a pandemic, I think did shake a lot of people's confidence. And that was also true of Great Britain. You know, we had a higher death rate than you did. And we had a prime minister who did seem to be really flummoxed by the pandemic to start off with, and made a number of rookie errors, I would say. Also, you had a second set of problems which shook the confidence of the world, which were totally Trump-related, really. And they were in terms of the global alliances. An American first policy, I'm almost tempted to say American first policy may be sensible, but don't tell anybody you're pursuing an American first policy. because you know, the essence of pursuing your own national interests is to pretend that you're pursuing everybody's interests. But to say that you're pursuing an American first policy alienates everybody. Of course it does. It has to. You know, you're making it clear that you're respond to yourself. Yeah, it's crazy not to do that. To withdraw from the World Health Organization at such a delicate time, to treat with contempt NATO, threaten to withdraw, almost withdraw from NATO, to be so indifferent to United Nations, all of that enormously weakened the United States around the world. And you know, Trump started off with some fairly reasonable points. It is the case that Europe has been a free rider, and a really mighty and powerful economy such as Germany was basically not paying its fair share for the protection from Russia, which is a good deal nearer to Germany than it is to whatever Sarah Palin might say, than it is to the United States. So, you know, he did start off with some legitimate complaints, but he took them to extraordinary and extreme lengths, and in a very, very counterproductive way. And that did shake the trust of the West. And, you know, it was very difficult even for Britain, which is much closer to the United States, much closer to Trump. Boris Johnson was closer to Trump. I must say, in Britain, you know, Boris Johnson and the Conservative government was glad to see the back of Trump, because although, you know, he'd made friendly noises, he was a very difficult and unreliable ally for Britain. So the combination of messing up a domestic issue and going around proving that you're an unreliable ally to the rest of the world was a terrible, terrible combination. I said some slightly harsh things about Biden's capacity to deal with the big domestic problems that America faces. But on international affairs, he's done extremely well. He's said exactly the right things. He's appointed an extremely strong and capable and very moderate team of people. and he's enormously reassured the rest of the world that America is a reliable ally. And I think that he needs to keep pushing, because I think it's A, you have to overcome trust, and B, in the time when America has been withdrawing from a lot of these institutions, China has been strengthening its role and supporting those institutions. So it'll take a lot of time to regain America's trust and position in those things. But definitely, America's global position is a lot better than it used to be. However, what has been going on while all of this is being while this drama has played out is that the emerging world, particularly emerging East Asia, has been growing relentlessly, both in power, economic power, and in political capacity and in political sophistication. You're not living in a world in which, while America sorts out its problems, the rest of the world is standing still. They're not. And that's one of the things that really worries me. If you look at the position of China now compared with 2000, it's a period of extraordinary improvement in not just China's economic strength, but in its state, in the power of its state, in the capacity of its state.
Indeed. Let's continue this theme, but head a little bit back towards COVID on the topic of vaccines and vaccine rollout. On February 28th, the New York Times editorial board published an article entitled "The Era of Vaccine Diplomacy is Here." We've all had to learn a lot of new vocabulary in the past year. Vaccine diplomacy is certainly a key idea. And the New York Times argues that from the premise that the pandemic will not be vanquished anywhere until it is vanquished everywhere. And we see countries like Israel, United Arab Emirates, Chile, the UK, and the US, here we are, outpacing the rest of the world in vaccinating their populations. While countries like China, India, and Russia, they're making deals with strategic allies to distribute their own homegrown vaccines, which have a piece of cultural pride, diplomacy, scientific, breadth and capacity built into that process. How can the world's poorest countries and their governments compete when so many nations are focused on first vaccinating their own populations and then making bilateral deals with their allies, which of course are laced with geopolitical strategy as well?
Great question. I think it's important to remember that before there was vaccine diplomacy, there was PPE diplomacy. Governments, particularly China, have seized on this issue from the very first as a source of potential geopolitical advantage. So China was very, very quick when Europe wasn't providing enough masks and PPE equipment to its citizens to send Chinese stuff, which was badged, it had the People's Republic of China flag put on it. So countries have seized on this from the very first. With vaccine diplomacy, it's even more important, it's even more visible. I think it's true on one level that you can't cure anybody without curing everybody. But it's also the case that vaccines make a big difference. If you're vaccinated against this disease, this condition, then you're much, much, much less likely to get it. So I can see a world in which there's still quite a lot of COVID around, let's say in South Africa, a much poorer country, in which America opens up again. People are going around their business fairly normally. And we have to remember now that China is basically opened up. They're going around their business fairly normally. So I think it's true on one level, it's not true on another level. Once you have a high level of vaccination and a general high level of herd immunity, because a number of people have had it, that we can go back to a relatively normal global economy, even though there is still some COVID around. We're not going to get rid of it entirely anyway. In terms of vaccine diplomacy, the real disaster of vaccine diplomacy now is Europe. Europe, 6 months ago, Europe was standing really quite pretty. It looked as though it had done an extremely good job of managing the virus. it looked as though it had overcome its initial problems and had got plenty of PPE, plenty of hospital places. And if one was to point to any particular person who had really done well, apart from the Prime Minister of New Zealand, it would be Angela Merkel. She was sort of the putative leader of the free world, I think, because of Trump's problems. That's all gone now. The Europeans have distributed the vaccine very slowly. They've behaved in a very, very peculiar way. So now what they're arguing is that AstraZeneca is dangerous. Oh, sorry, I haven't heard the latest report from the, which is I think happening now from the European health people on whether it's safe or not. But the number of leading politicians have said it's not safe, whilst at the same time storing it and saying, you know, we don't want to export it because it's ours. We need it to inject in our people. So that it's just sitting in fridges. And as we know, the confidence of the population in vaccines is very fragile. And if you have a leading politician saying one of these vaccines isn't safe, then people don't take it. So, you know, so at the moment, there are millions of vaccines sitting unused and millions of people who say they won't use it. So I think Europe's reputation as being competent, being a sort of post-national state that looks to that is the bulwark of a rules-governed global order, has really taken a big bashing at the moment. You know, recently, the one country that has done extraordinarily well out of this whole thing is China, because if you go back to the beginning, this was a virus which started in China. It was a virus which spread because the Chinese authoritarian state wouldn't admit to it, tried to cover it up, which gave it about a month to spread around the world. And yet the Chinese regime now is, again, you know, that the business is open, that people are going around their business as normal. The Chinese are using the vaccine to solidify relationships around the world. And China is looking quite good at the moment. They, you know, we say in our book, you know, it looked as though this vaccine was this virus was going to be China's Chernobyl, and now that it was the West's Waterloo. And the West's collective reputation has suffered a big blow. They say it was America that looked bad. Now it's Europe that looks bad, and it was also Britain that looked bad. Britain is looking a lot better.
The Chinese Chernobyl and the West's Waterloo. That's a
yes. If Waterloo is a familiar reference, no.
So let's think a little bit towards the future. Of course, COVID isn't over, and as you point out, will never be fully gone. But we know that more crises will come, right? And the next crisis is almost certainly climate change or climate change related.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should hope for that known foe, as dark as it is, so that nothing even worse creeps up between the pandemic and the impacts of climate change that scientists are saying are heading our way quickly. So I'd like to ask you, do the recommendations for governing that you suggest in your book apply to the climate crisis? And if so, how? What can we learn?
Absolutely. I mean, the essence of the argument of our book, government really, really matters. That government is the difference between living and dying. That this quality of the state, the ability of the state to think about the future and to act, is something that's absolutely vital. And there has been a sort of feeling in the West, particularly in the United States, that government at its best is a problem. Reagan said back in 1980, you know, government is not the problem. Government is not the solution, it's the problem. Reagan joked that the 10 most terrifying words in the English language is, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. And that was a valuable corrective. You know, government got too big, got too flabby, got too undisciplined in the 1970s, but we've moved much too far in the other direction. That we've run down the quality of government. Government is not attracting people, the best people, in the way that it used to. Government is not as self-confident as it used to be in the 1960s, and government is just not very modern. You know, we have figures in our book about the average age of technology in the healthcare, in the Department of Health, which is that, you know, about 20% of computers, information systems are literally out of date, in the sense that you cannot any longer buy repairing equipment because there's nothing that exists to support them. That more than 20% of people, the Department of Health employs more IT people over the age of 60 than it does under the age of 30, which is, I say, not the distribution of talent in that area. I know this myself because I have no talent in that area. Young people are the people who know all about these things. So there are all sorts of ways in which government is antiquated, starved of talent, just not up to the job. And that is a huge problem for climate change. The only way that we can deal with climate change is to have a government, a political class, a political system, a state that is capable of dealing with big problems, partly because you have to think about the future and organize big infrastructure investments to deal with carbon capture and all the rest of it, partly because you have to think about the future, and partly because you have to mobilize political consent for something that's very difficult. You know, people are going to lose their jobs. Some people will get poorer, some, you know, as a result of this. We'll all have to bear some cost for dealing with these things. So you need a political class that is much more capable than the political class that we have. We have a number of arguments in our book, you know, for saying that we need to improve government, a number of suggestions for improving government, which I hope aren't just suggestions for having a bigger government. I think it's crucially an argument for having a better government. And some of the things we argue in the book, for example, is we think that we should have a return of national service, in the sense, not military national service, but civic national service, that everybody who comes out of school in the United States should spend, let's say, a year, or let's say 6 months, working in the public sector. And I think that would be good for them, because I think a lot of people are just completely divorced from the public sector. They regard it as just something that takes their taxes, that they want to have nothing to do with. And I think it would be good for the government, because it would relink the government with huge pools of talent that are no longer used. We also argue that there should be a whole culture of public service revised in the United States. In the 1960s, you know, we remember Kennedy saying, you know, do not ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That whole spirit of civic service, of public service, has not disappeared, but it's much, much weaker than it used to be. And I very sincerely hope that Joe Biden, who's a man who's given his life to public service, will try and reignite this on a much more general level. So it's I haven't given a specific answer to your problem about what we do about climate change, because I think in order to deal with climate change, or in order to deal with the next pandemic, which will certainly come, or to deal with another big problem that we can't even think about, we don't know the future, will be a complete surprise to us, a black swan or whatever you want to call it. We need to have this generic solution, which is a better, more focused, more resilient, better, more talented government, more talented public sector. And that involves, particularly for the United States, a big change of direction from the direction that it took in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Governing, that's the direction. And as we've talked to other experts around the world, that continues to resonate, the failure of government and the solutions and structure that it can provide. I think we all felt so flat-footed by this pandemic and surprised. It's made us lean into systems more. We've got a few questions coming in from our audience, and I want to make sure they get a chance to interact with you. As always here at the Council, we like to start with a question from a young person, from a student, and these leaders who maybe will bring tech and innovation into our governing solutions for the future. Today, we've got Kylie Williams, who is a student at St. Joseph's University. We know Kylie because she volunteers her time as a mentor to middle schoolers in our region who compete and succeed, taking the place of countries in a junior model United Nations program. So rest assured, there's a bunch of 12 and 13-year-olds out there working on these problems using technology. Kylie is one of their mentors. So Kylie, I'll turn it over to you. What question do you have for Adrian today?
Great, thank you so much. So COVID has been obviously an extraordinarily global experience because so many countries have been affected. You've mentioned how COVID has affected government structures and policies, but how do you think that global diplomacy has been changed because of COVID? And do you think that these changes will carry forward even when we move on from COVID as an issue and address problems such as climate change, like you guys were just talking about, or that may not have as wide an effect as COVID?
Well, I think the initial, it's a great question. I think that there was a sort of paradox that which COVID created was COVID demonstrated that pandemics are global phenomena, that they cannot be contained within borders. Nature is to spread wherever people have contact with each other, which in a global economy is everywhere. But it also demonstrated the continued power of the nation state, because the first thing that nation states did when they were confronted with this pandemic was to look to their own citizens and to look to the question of how they would look after their own citizens. So even the European Union, which is explicitly an attempt to create a post-national government, actually started reintroducing all sorts of national policies and continues to be quite nationalistic in what it's doing about vaccines. So you have a very interesting question. On the one hand, we need a global solution. On the other hand, governments naturally look to their own citizens first, and in some ways rightly so. So what it means is that we have to construct and reinforce an architecture of cooperation through the United Nations and through the World Health Organization. But we have to do that in not a sort of pie in the sky way, in a way that takes into account the fact that nations really, really matter, and that nations are not going to go anywhere soon, and be conscious of the fact that it's nations that are cooperating, I think, with each other, whatever the forum is. So I think it's a dose of realism almost, that in a panic, people will always look to their local leaders first, and they won't, easily sort of start giving things away. You need to be a bit realistic about what's going on. And I think that one of the worst things that's happened to this in this vaccine is that the European Union has suddenly claimed the power and the right to run vaccine policy. That's a policy that's always up till now been done by nation states, and suddenly the Europeans claimed that it was Brussels that should be in charge of these things, and in fact made a complete mess of it, because it hadn't been the case in the past. It's the case that nations, individual states have been in charge of purchasing and allocating vaccines and medicines. So it was a power grab on their part. So we need a very careful balance between the power of the nation state and the power of the transnational organization. And we can't be too utopian about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Adrian, we've got a couple of questions about the World Health Organization, so yeah. I'll blend them together. Eric asks us, or mentions, right, that the World Health Organization received mixed reviews for handling of the COVID pandemic. Well, Edmund, who's in the audience today, says, what about the WHO being complicit with China, that you never being clear about the analysis or finding out the true source of the virus? So, and Eric follows up, what is the role of international organizations like the World Health Organization or the UN, for example, in public health crises going forward? And has it shifted? Does it need to shift? How do we work with these large institutions to get over what has happened and plan better for the future?
Sure. The World Health Organization has had mixed reviews, absolutely. But who hasn't had mixed reviews? Trump got mixed reviews. Has Boris Johnson got mixed reviews? Now have the Europeans got mixed reviews? Everybody has made a hash of things. This was an extraordinary, not everybody has made a hash of things. Everybody has had problems dealing with this. This is an extraordinarily big thing that came and tested us to our limits in some ways. And the important thing is not to point too many fingers at the World Health Organization, certainly not to withdraw from the World Health Organization. I think that was a major mistake, but to use this experience to fix it and make it better. Secondly, that it's covered up Chinese problems. Yes, it did. And it's not been honest about China, and China has not been honest with it. That is a problem. But if you're an organization which is a composite of nation states, which has lots of different members who are contributing money and expertise to you, you can't just ride roughshod over one of your biggest and most powerful members. So you don't want to be too complicit with that member if it's trying to paper over problems. But on the other hand, you can't just order it around. You know, there's a limit to what these organizations can do. So it's true, but diplomacy is diplomacy, and you have to have a degree of diplomacy in this. What can these organizations do? One of the most important things that it can do is distribute information and facts and science and solutions to problems. And I think that that was one of their biggest problems in the early time. They didn't distribute information and knowledge fast enough. But that's not just a problem with the World Health Organization. I think it's also a problem with the West more generally, that we weren't really very willing to be told that the Chinese or the Singaporeans or the Taiwanese actually had really sensible solutions to these problems. You know, we didn't look at them and say, we better be wearing masks, we better close our airports, we better introduce a quarantine system. We weren't willing to learn from these people, despite the fact that they had you know, a long history of dealing with SARS. So I think it was a sort of a collective belief, A, that it wouldn't happen to us, and B, that these people were a long way off and they didn't really know what they were doing. They were slightly odd and hysterical. So the WHO failed to distribute information, but we failed also to be you know, intelligent listeners. I hope that's changed. And finally, what else can they do? Well, you know, whatever can be done to distribute vaccines is the most important thing, because we have to get vaccines into our own arms, but we have to get vaccines as much as possible around the world to poorer countries that can't necessarily afford them. And that's a huge role for multinational organizations and charities, the Gates Foundation, the rest of them, of all sorts.
That builds on a question we have in our audience from Ian. He says the U.S. is sending surplus AstraZeneca vaccine to Canada and Mexico. What about the U.S. approving this vaccine domestically to bolster confidence that this is an effective and safe vaccine?
I feel slightly, it's difficult for me to answer this question because I don't know what the Europeans have just said. I don't know if you've seen it on your screen about what the Europeans have just said about AstraZeneca. I think they're reporting on it this afternoon. I'm very surprised that America has been so slow to approve AstraZeneca. You know, we've had now millions of people vaccinated with AstraZeneca, and all the scientists that I've read or talked to say that the scare about AstraZeneca is foolish, and that the number of people who've got blood clots is no larger than you'd expect in a big population. You know, so I don't know why America has been so slow, and it does seem strange to be exporting things unless that it's just companies that have already got contracts with Canada to distribute them, not to use them. I've now been vaccinated, and I didn't have the AstraZeneca. I had Pfizer, but many people I've known have had AstraZeneca and have had no problems as a result of that. And also, even if there is a slight problem, you know, with AstraZeneca, it's minor compared with the problem of not having a COVID vaccination at all.
Indeed. We have a question here from Maggie, and she says that she believes it was back in 2014 that the Obama administration proposed and Congress funded a bipartisan effort, a pandemic response program following the scare we had related to Ebola.
Yep.
And then more recently, the Trump administration signed the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act of 2019 into law. Why didn't these programs and laws such as these help with the US response to COVID-19?
Yeah. Many countries have had quite elaborate and well worked out sort of programs to respond to pandemics. And many countries have found that they haven't really delivered as well as they would have hoped to have done. It's not just America. Britain had exactly the same thing. And the big problem was that they were basically flu that they were concerned about. It was flu pandemics that they kept looking at. Certainly the case in Britain, it was all about an influenza, very serious influenza pandemic that they were worried about. Now, it's not impossible to adapt a COVID strategy, a flu strategy to a COVID strategy, but they were perhaps looking slightly in the wrong direction, or it may well be a case they're looking in the right direction, and we may have a flu pandemic coming down the turnpike. A lot of people believe that we will have one at some point in the future. The second is that a lot of the equipment that was stockpiled, actually Clinton also did some of this, that it was stockpiled from the 1990s onwards, that from the Obama era onwards, was allowed to decay. So a lot of the PPE, for example, proved to be unusable when they got it out. A lot of the stockpiles just hadn't been kept up to date. I think there was a failure of policy on the part of the Trump administration not to take this seriously enough. But even without that failure, I think you probably have found that some of the PPE stuff just didn't work, and that too much of the policy thinking had been about flu. I also want to say that I've been persistently and frequently rude about the Trump administration. But it's not just the Trump administration that's failed on this. I mean, if you look at the New York City and New York State, both Democratic fiefdoms, and they did really quite badly in terms of their response. You know, a lot of the breathing apparatus didn't work. A lot of the PPE was decayed. There was a poor relationship between Albany and New York City. There's a lot of squabbling. There was a lot of incompetence. And I really, again, would like to, re-emphasize the point that if you look at the emerging world, particularly at the Far East, there was just a lot better practices on the ground. And what one figure that pops into my head is that the number of people who've died in New York City from COVID is 25,000. Seoul, which is a slightly bigger city in terms of population than New York City, has had less than 100 people die. 25,000 versus 100 people. And that's just because they were better at testing, better at tracing, better at distributing PPE, better at stopping people from circulating around once they'd got COVID, just better municipal policies. And this was even before the vaccination started rolling out. So I think it's a government problem, and it's not just a government problem that's linked to Trump, although he made things worse, but also to much more generic things in the United States. So, essentially what I'm trying to say is that the reason that we didn't roll out a solution, a resilient solution based on predicting that there was going to be a big problem in the future, is that just government wasn't that good.
Yeah, that's the intent of the solutions you position in the book. It's about governance and creating structures to handle what shocks may be coming, pandemic, climate change, and whatever black swan may be headed their way.
Absolutely.
Adrian, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time and perspective with us today. An hour sure goes fast, and I know we could talk about many more subjects, but thank you for your time.
The time is already gone. Well, thank you so much. It's very kind of you to invite me. Great. Have a nice rest of the day.
Yes, and for our audience members, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book that Adrian wrote, you can certainly do so through our website, which links to an independent bookseller in Philadelphia called Joseph Fox. And please do consider joining us at the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for upcoming programs. Next week, we launch our new Beyond Our Borders series, where we'll focus on Chile from a political, economic, and cultural perspective for a number of months. We kick off this series next Thursday, the 25th, when we are honored to host 2 Chilean senators who are at the forefront of rewriting their constitution, a process that was sparked by citizen activism recently in the past year and then validated by a national plebiscite last October. This is democracy in action, and we're really excited to have these senators here to talk with us in Philadelphia, where we know a thing or two about writing a constitution, to have a discussion about what the future holds for Chile. And those 2 Chilean senators have invited us to meet them in the Senate of Chile next March in 2022 for a luncheon to see how far they've come. In our travel program, we offer a trip to Chile in March 2022, where we'll follow up on that discussion and get to go to the Chilean Senate. Then on April 14th, we're hosting a conversation with the Deputy Director of the organization Air Wars, where we will learn about the cost of military airstrikes in civilian places like Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. We encourage you to join us for those events and more to be announced soon, which you can find all on our website at wacphila.org. Thank you to Adrian and everyone for joining us this afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.